Well, hello everyone. In this video, I'll be building a monitor stand for my desk. As you can see, my setup tends to collect a lot of garbage, so this project was definitely necessary, at least according to my wife. To start, I drew up some plans the old-fashioned way with paper and a pencil. I haven't quite mastered making plans with the computer. Anyways, what I wanted for this was a monitor stand that would sit on top of my desk with drawers big enough to hold paper and all the other things that live on my desk. And I didn't want to add drawers underneath my desk. With my current setup, there's just not enough legroom, and I hope to build myself a new desk someday anyway. Now, I didn't want to spend any money on this, so my goal was to build it entirely out of scrap wood, using whatever I had on hand, including any supplies I could scrounge up. Luckily, I had some leftover ash from the workbench build, so that's what I used for the entire project. The first thing I did was jointed one face and one edge, then planed everything to the same thickness. And then I basically made a butcher block style panel, kind of like a countertop. To do that, I needed everything to be perfectly squared, and then I went through and paired all my boards to try to maximize the yield for each panel. To glue them, I first glued the two end pieces, and I basically just lifted one side using some scrap wood, then applied tape. That way, when you lay it flat, the tape will pull it together, creating two extended boards, and it will hold them together so that I wasn't fighting them too much, or fighting with too many pieces while gluing and clamping them. I basically just glued 4 pieces of wood together at a time, using the tape to hold everything in place. Without the tape, I would have had a bad time trying to keep everything flat. Once it dried, I ran one edge through the joiner to clean it up, then glued those two edges together, making one panel. Then once that dried, I ran it through the joiner one last time to square up one edge, then used the table saw to make the opposite side parallel, and going as slow as possible to avoid getting a rough edge, which I tend to get rough cuts on my table saw because if I press too hard, I can flex that fence. Anyways, after that, I grabbed my table saw sled to square up the ends and cut them to length. Now, I didn't have quite enough material to make the panels big enough, so I decided to use some Black Limba that I had on hand, basically adding a 1/2 inch trim around each panel with a 45-degree miter. And I just used tape here to help clamp everything together. On a side note, this video is interesting to make to me because up until now, I've been using Clipchamp as my main video editing tool. It was working pretty well for me, mostly because it was so simple to use, but I started running into some limitations in terms of options of what I could do, and I had a lot of instability issues where things would get corrupted and I'd have to start completely over. So I upgraded to Premiere Pro, and let me tell you, it was a pretty huge learning curve, but I've never been one to shy away from learning new things, and now I think I'm starting to get the hang of it. I'm definitely liking it a lot more, so hopefully the quality of my videos will improve moving forward. Anyways, once the glue dried on these panels, I ran them through the drum sander. The trim was running lengthwise, and if I had ran it through the planer, I probably would have gotten a lot of blowout on one end. The drum sander is a lot kinder when thicknessing against the grain. Next, I wanted to make these X-like things for what you could basically call the walls of the monitor stand. The first thing I did was cut some 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch sticks, then cut them all to the same length. Then I used my table saw sled to create a 45-degree angle jig. This allowed me to set up each piece, make a cut, then move it until I got a channel exactly 1/2 inch wide and in the center of the stick. Once everything was cut, I clamped it in the vise and used a chisel to clean up the bottom of the channel. Then just added a little bit of glue, and there you go, 4 big X's. Next, I used my table saw sled again, taping down some scrap pieces that helped me place the X's in a way that I could cut the ends parallel with each other and at the correct length, with the intersection being at the center. Then I glued 2 pieces on each end, making sure they were as flat as possible. I didn't really worry about them being too long. In fact, I purposely made them a little bit over length so I could trim them down later. Once that dried, I used the end pieces as my square to cut one side down. Then I taped down some scrap wood to my sled, giving myself a reference, ensuring each side was the exact same height and not all wonky. This way, by cutting these down, I was able to create just a little bit more surface area and reduce the amount of direct end grain for the glue joint, which makes it a little less delicate. Then I just used my calipers to position each side about 1/4 of an inch from each edge. Once they're in place, I taped them down to keep them from shifting or moving around too much while I clamped them down using cam clamps. I started by gluing the 2 outer walls first. Once those were in place, I then glued the 2 inner walls. That way I could measure 14 inches from the inside of each outer wall to ensure that the drawers would be uniform in size. And then I designed the center space to be open, so it didn't matter what the length was. Once those dried, I glued on the second panel, creating a sandwich. I made sure to spread the glue evenly, being careful not to apply too much near the edges towards the center, minimizing squeeze out and making the cleanup a lot easier. Then I placed the panel on top using my square to line up each side and double check everything was square. Once everything looked good, I used my can clamps to secure the edges, then lifted it onto the table to access the center. Easy peasy. Now for the legs, this part was a bit tricky because they were so small and I wanted them to look like they were going through the panels. To achieve that, I used the same 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch sticks, then added 45-degree supports to strengthen and add a tiz bit of character. The next thing I did was make drawers. These were made from ash plywood, which was actually leftover from building the workbench. I started by cutting the sides and then used a dado saw to cut out a channel to hold the bottom of the drawer. Now, I didn't want any of the plywood edges to be exposed, so I added trim to the back edge faces since the back of the monitor stand is open, and I added these before I glued the sides together so that they wouldn't stick out. I don't know if that makes sense, but it makes sense in my head. Anyways, then I used double-sided tape to hold the trim in place, which turned out to be a mistake, because once I glued the sides together, the glue seeped into the tape, causing it to swell up and it looked stupid. So, lesson learned there. Once everything was glued up, I drilled 4 holes on each side to insert dowels, adding some extra strength and a bit more detail. Then after hammering them in, I wiped away any excess glue, then used a flush trim saw to cut them down, and sanded them while the glue was wet, allowing the sawdust to fill any gaps. Next, I applied edge banding all around the top and bottom of the drawer boxes. I used a razor and a hammer to cut the miters. Then, one by one, I removed each piece, applied some glue, and then taped it back into place. For the drawer faces, I went with a shaker-style design, which was a bit of a challenge due to the small size of each piece. I started by cutting everything to length, then cut out a channel using a dado saw, and then made the rails using the crosscut sled. After that, I just glued everything up, making sure everything was lined up properly. I designed the drawer faces so that the recess for the center panel is exactly the same thickness as the panel itself. This way, I could glue up a piece on the back of the panel, allowing it to sit flush against the front of the drawer box. For the drawer handles, I chose a super complicated, unique style. I call it rectangle blocks. Then I just drilled holes in the center and added a threaded insert to each one, and I used some Minwax to help negotiate the inserts and make it easier to screw them in. Back to the drawers. Here I'm adding some what I'm going to call our runners to the bottom of each drawer. My goal was for them to look like they were floating inside of the monitor stand when you look at it from the side. These runners will be what the drawers sit on once they're inside the stand. Then to install what I'm going to call are the slides, I first place the drawers in position with spacers on each side. Then I use 2 long pieces of wood to put on the inside of the runners, made a mark, then clamped them into place where the runners was to act as a stop. After that, I use super glue to attach slides securely to the bottom of the panel, which will sit on the inside of each runner and allow the drawers to not shift from side to side. After that, I installed the drawer faces using some Uno cards to help center them. Once everything was aligned, I drilled 1 screw into the pre-drilled hole to hold it in place. Then I pulled the drawer face forward and used clamps to secure it. And as you can see, I also had a sacrificial piece of plywood inside the drawer so that I didn't get any blowout for the next step, which was once everything was clamped, I unscrewed the temporary screw and drilled all the way through the drawer. After that, I took everything apart, and usually people would go in and screw it in from the inside of the drawer to secure the face while they install the handle, but I didn't do that. I mainly didn't do it because I didn't have enough screws, and instead I opted to glue the drawer faces on because I will do anything to avoid making a trip to the hardware store. So what I did was use the drawer handle to position and screw it in from the inside. Then, using the playing cards again to help line it up, I tightened the screw as much as I could, pulled it back out, and then applied clamps to the sides or ends to apply pressure and hold everything in place. And I let it sit for about half an hour, then came back, unscrewed the handle, and cleaned off the excess glue. After that, I glued the handle in place and screwed it back in from the outside. That way it won't get loose in the future. Then once they were tightened down, I removed the clamps and left it to dry overnight. Once those were dry, I added a stop by measuring the thickness of the drawer and the drawer face and marked it off where the face sits flush with the front of the monitor stand. Then I just used super glue to glue it in place. For the finish, I used tried and true because it was what I had on hand, but I wanted a slightly darker look, so I added some black dye to it, which worked really well. It helped make the grain pop and gave it some depth. Right here, you can see that I applied the finish incorrectly. I used a spoon to smear it on, then wiped it off with a rag right away, which wasn't the best method. I should have used a credit card or a squeegee to spread it out evenly before wiping it off. I learned my lesson when I applied the second coat, but I wasn't thinking clearly at the time here. I also wished I applied the finish before I glued the panels together because it was super hard getting into all the small corners, but it worked in the end. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you're interested in having me build something like this for you, feel free to reach out to my website at ncmguitars.com. Please like and subscribe. I'm hoping to create more content soon. Anywho, bye.